데이비드 알턴의 두 번째 메시지는 비교적 편한 분위기에서 발표됐습니다. 사단법인 크레도가 법률, 정치, 인권, 언론, 기업 분야 전문가 20여 명을 초대해 마련한 좌담입니다.
My name is Eun Park. I am the board member and chair of International Committee of Credo Association. Credo Association is a not-for-profit organization which is to promote freedom and human rights based on human dignity through rule of law and justice. Among the guests participating in the fireside chat with us today are the board members of the Credo Association, retired justices, judges, and distinguished lawyers, diplomats, professors, businessmen, and human rights activists. We are different in callings and thoughts, but I believe it's the passion that and hope which bring us together here to shine a light on the closest but hidden nation, North Korea. Lord Alton, you said earlier that when you first brought North Korea issue to the parliament, you put the both agenda, security and human rights.
Yeah.
I think that Korea is really struggling as to North Korea issues between security and human rights, because some of the people who are passive on raising human rights think that raising human rights might provocate North Koreans, and then it would elevate security issues. So then there's always going back and forth.
Yep.
You know the story that depending upon the government and their views, I think that North Korean human rights issues have not really improved that much. So probably, Lord Alton, you may have some advice or observation to this.
Dr. Park, it would be arrogant of me to tell you what to do for the best, but let me share this with you, that as a young member of the House of Commons, we were in the middle of the Cold War. I travelled during that period behind the Iron Curtain to take evidence for a group I founded called the Jubilee Campaign, and we raised individual cases. 7 Siberian Pentecostal Christians, for instance, who'd ended up in the basement of the American Embassy in Moscow, were there for 3 years. But this was a case that we were able to get everybody interested in, and then they started to be interested in the persecution that was taking place against Christians as well as Jews, of course, in the former Soviet Union. And individual cases came along like that, and I corresponded with our then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher about it. She became a patron of our Jubilee campaign, and I was very impressed because of two things. Firstly, that she, in Moscow, they called her the Iron Lady. Why? Because she was not a soft touch. She knew that for every SS-20 and every SS-22 that the Soviet Union lined up in our direction, that we needed to have our own independent nuclear weapon. It was Polaris, it's now Trident, but we also needed to increase the firepower, the capacity of the United Kingdom should it come to a nuclear war. And so an alliance was made with our closest allies, the United States, to bring cruise and Pershing missiles to the United Kingdom. It was very controversial. But we also said very clearly in terms there would never be any first use of these nuclear weapons. They were there for our defense, and they were there to ensure that if the Soviet Union ever attacked us, then they would be starting the annihilation of Europe. And even now, in the context of Ukraine, you can see that deterrence plays its part, the knowledge that the other side has extraordinary firepower. I've used it before, but I remind myself of the words of Khrushchev, who said, only if there was a nuclear war, he said, the living would envy the dead. And any sane person surely knows that. It was very significant that this mutually assured destruction had the acronym MAD, M-A-D, and it is sheer madness if they were ever to be used. So on one hand, we have to be strong. If it looks as though we're weak, then the aggressor will bully us. So you have to be strong. But is that the end of the argument? No, of course not. What did Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan do next? They began the Helsinki process with the support, and there is a difference therefore here of the way we handle the situation today, maybe particularly with China and North Korea, but the Helsinki group, with many of them were people who came from backgrounds where they understood the rule of law, they were academicians, they were part of the intelligentsia, they had been brave in setting up their groups in Moscow to promote human rights. And so Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher adopted this. And we were very fortunate that the world's religious leader at that moment became Karol Wojtyła, the Polish Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyła, and with his knowledge of both Nazism and communism, having suffered under both, he gave a very not Ostpolitik, which the Vatican had pursued up until then. He rejected that. No Ostpolitik. He said, no, we stand firm with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in saying this must change. He supported, of course, his friend Lech Wałęsa in creating solidarity in Poland, and we know how the churches then right across Eastern and Central Europe had courage in the years that then followed. This was the Helsinki process at work. It was bringing about change. He would say, John Paul would say regularly, be not afraid. There's a great movie called 9 Days That Changed the World about how he then went as Pope to Poland, and the Polish communist authorities just didn't know how to handle this. And the millions who came out as a consequence had courage and bravery in facing down communism. And in 1989, we see the wall fall. I mean, if you'd said to me in 1986, 87, you'll see it fall in a couple of years, I would have said, I don't think so, but we'll carry on working in the hope that it will one day collapse. I was in Ukraine in 1988. I got arrested going into Ukraine, but they released me and they let me in. And I spent a couple of days, I spent a day with a bishop who'd spent 17 years in Soviet prisons. The priest who was his chaplain had been sent to Chernobyl to clear radioactive waste as a punishment for being caught celebrating the liturgies. I visited churches that had been closed by Stalin 40 years earlier. 40 years. They hadn't been able to go inside. Every day ladies would arrive and lay flowers in front of the doors. Every day the Soviets would take away the flowers, and the next day the women would come again. Here was resilience and courage. 300,000 people illegally came out onto the street, into the public squares that weekend in order to demonstrate for democracy. And in a way, President Zelensky has inherited that courage, and that from that fight for liberty and freedom in the late 80s, they know how precious that gift is, which is why they've shown, I think, such extraordinary courage in withstanding Putin. So, the Helsinki process brought change, not completely, nothing is perfect. In every generation you have to renew these things. Who knows where it will end? And maybe just as I didn't see how quickly things might move in 1989, maybe we'll see fundamental changes if the people themselves are able to withstand the brutality of some of the regimes that we're now dealing with.
You have visited North Korea 4 times. You were sanctioned by China, but you were not sanctioned by North Korea yet. So are you going to visit if they invite you again?
Well, I've also been sanctioned now by Iran as well. So one of our government ministers said to me, David, will you give me a list of countries where you haven't been sanctioned? And we have to keep a bit of a sense of humour. They even sanctioned my family, so my children. I have 4 wonderful children. My daughter is a lawyer. And to underline the point, their ambassador came in to see me with his number 2. His number 2, you met and I met a couple of days ago. This man was the most senior diplomat, North Korean diplomat in the world to defect. His ambassador had not liked a speech I'd made about North Korea and about human rights. So he came in to tell me, had a long, big folder with all my speeches and questions in. I was very impressed that somebody had read all of these. And he said, he started reading me a denunciation. And in the end, he got bored and he said to me, so he said, oh, we hate you. So I said, Ambassador, I love you, but I hate your system. And I hope one day it changes. Now, as we were leaving the building, the House of Lords, he looked around to see if the number 2 was overhearing him, and he wasn't. And the ambassador grabbed my hand and said, "No hard feelings." And I thought, this is a very strange diplomatic exchange. Those of you amongst you who have been ambassadors, I hope you haven't treated any parliamentarians quite as I was treated that day. But anyway, a few weeks later, the Foreign Office telephoned me to say, there's a man who's arrived here with his wife and children who says that he knows you, and he's the number 2 in the North Korean embassy. And I said, oh, that will be Mr. Tae. And he said, yes, Mr. Tae wishes to defect. So I thought, this is extraordinary. Mr. Tae tells me, these are his words, he said, I was your spy. He said, my job was to send back all the speeches and all the questions. I was so pleased. I thought, good, they monitored every one of those 400 interventions and sent it back to Pyongyang. Well, I would want them to do that. Of course I would want them to do that. Because I want them to know that despite the information blockade that they have tried to impose around North Korea, in breach, I might add, of Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, despite that, information comes out and information goes in. It was one of the reasons I campaigned for successfully the BBC to extend its transmissions to the Korean Peninsula. And I again would say to those, especially of you who are retired diplomats, please encourage the British government not to reduce the Korean service. I'm having a fight with them at the moment. They're not going to abolish the service, but they are going to reduce it. And I think that would be a great tragedy. This is a time to keep information flowing. If we want to change things, it'll be by people knowing what's going on. And that brings me to the heart of your question. I love your country. I love the Republic of Korea. I was disappointed that you were saying and doing less about human rights issues. I understand the reasons why you might want to come to that conclusion, but I'm delighted that your new government has said that it is going to increase its interest in human rights and speak more vociferously about these things. As I said, the Helsinki process didn't neglect one at the expense of the other. We've got to do both. These are not binary, they're not mutually exclusive things. Caring about security should be the top priority of any government. But alongside that must sit its belief in the human rights and human dignity of every single one of its citizens. And for you, that means all of the people of North Korea.
알통경의 이번 방안을 주관한 사단법인 크레도의 이은경 대표 인사말입니다.
오늘 귀한 시간 너무나 감명 깊었습니다. 알통경께서 무려 새벽 차례나 북한 사람들의 그 처참한 상황의 해결을 위해서 그렇게 애써주신 점은 정말 머리를 깊이 숙여서 경의를 표합니다. 마침 통일부의 권 장관께서도 우리 대한민국에서 이제 북한 인권 문제는 북한의 비핵화 문제만큼이나 동등한 가치를 가지는 중요한 이슈다 말씀하셨고요. 사실은 대통령께서도 북한 인권이 우리의 안보 이슈임을 천명한 바 있습니다. 마침 알통경께서 오셔서 대한민국 사회에서 그동안 사실은 너무 논쟁적인 이슈로 치부되었고 사실은 활발한 토론이 이루어지기 어려웠던 그 북한 이슈 문제에 대해서 다시 한번 논의를 짚게 해주신 것입니다. 너는 생명을 취하라 하신 그 정신을 저희도 같이 가고 싶습니다.